All right, Dr. Maattanen, are you ready to start?
Sure.
All right, all right. All right, everyone. Welcome to Lifestyle Med Live. We really thank you for joining us today. Uh, and before we begin, I just want to just do some housekeeping things. First, this is being recorded and live streamed on Facebook as we speak. So just to adjust your camera, adjust your audio accordingly. So this is being recorded and this is live streamed. All right. We are going to take questions. It's going to happen at the end, not during. So if you have a question, and we hope to get to as many questions as possible, please type your question in the chat as the presentation is going. And then when Dr. Matanen is done his talk, then we will try to get to as many of your questions as possible. Question answer is always the most fun and interesting time in events like this. So we want to encourage you to ask your questions. There's no a dumb question, just ask your questions. Dr. Martin is here as a resource for you. And so we want to ensure that you get your questions answered and we try to get to as many as possible. Also, just to be aware, this is for educational purposes only. So please speak with a healthcare provider before applying any of the information shared today. All right. We have two sponsors that are sponsoring this program. First is Pathways to Wholeness Lifestyle Medicine, which is a naturopathic and lifestyle medicine clinic in the Toronto area. If you'd like to learn more about what we do at the clinic, you can go to that website there or call that number. Also, this program is also hosted by Lifestyle is Medicine. Lifestyle is Medicine is a non-for-profit organization based in Toronto, and lifestyle medicine puts on lifestyle medicine programming for the community. We try to educate people on the basic principles of lifestyle medicine. Lifestyle is Medicine is the main host of this program. So we want to thank both organizations for hosting this wonderful program. Today, we're discussing one of the hottest topics in science, in medical science today, which is the gut microbiome. For the last decade or so, I would say tons of research is coming out on this topic. There's realizing that the gut microbiome is massively important for human health. It affects your brain, depression, immunity, of course, the gut. It has impacts on even diseases that we never really thought that there was a connection before, like type 2 diabetes, heart disease, and the list goes on and on. The more we're studying, the more we are realizing how important the gut microbiome is. But unfortunately, there's also a lot of confusion about how to live a lifestyle that best promotes gut health. And so to get through all the weeds and to help us, we have someone who is qualified to speak on this topic is Dr. Pekka Maattanen. Dr. Maattanen is a professor of biology at Burman University in Alberta. He's also gut microbiome researcher. He did research most recently at the Hospital for Sick Children, and he is an expert in this area. And we want to really thank Dr. Maattanen for donating his time to speak with our group today to help us understand, what does the science actually say, not the gimmicks, but what does the science actually say, and also the latest science on how to maintain and keep a healthy gut microbiome. So Dr. Maattanen, thanks so much for joining on the program today. Welcome to Lifestyle Med Live, and the floor is yours.
Thank you for inviting me to come join. I'm glad you guys have such a thing going on as this during this interesting time we're living, right? So yeah, I'm excited to start. So should I just jump in? I'll just share my screen here. That's fine. Second here, I just want to make sure. Just 1 second, I'm going to make sure my okay. I can share here. Okay. Everybody see that okay?
Yep.
All right, wonderful. I don't know if they can see me at the same time, or it doesn't really matter so much. It's more about the slides at the moment. Um, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the microbiome. Hopefully we can have some time for questions and answers. Thankful that you've joined for this Lifestyle is Medicine webinar. I've titled the talk, Feed Your Friends, Starve Your Foes. And you can see this gentleman here looking very intently at the battle within, and recognizing that that there is a battle. And so he's trying to fight the good fight with a little bit of yogurt, right? So this is probably what many of you have heard about is yogurt. You know, it's probiotic. It has all these good things in it to promote your gut bacteria. So we're going to talk a little bit about the microbiome. What are some of the ways we can, at least that have been shown, that we can support a good, healthy microbiome? And then certainly this is an active area that's not very well, how do we say, understood entirely yet. So we're going to talk about some of the unknowns, and hopefully there'll be lots of questions. So with that, let me continue on here. Well, it's not letting me. Oh, there we go. So before I go on, I have a bit of a disclaimer here. You know, I'm not your doctor, so I'm not here to give you medical advice, nor am I a mental health practitioner. I'm not talking too much about mental health here, but you all know there's a gut-brain axis, potentially anyway. So any changes you make in your own lifestyle, make sure you talk to your doctor about that. You know, of course, I think you can go and try some different foods, and you probably don't have to consult with your doctor on that. But, you know, keep in mind that making any major changes, you should talk to your doctor about. So with that, many of you have probably heard this before, that this is not a new thing. The idea that the gut is important, even though it's become a big hype nowadays, the fact that the gut is important has been known for a long time. Hippocrates even stated that all disease begins in the gut. And he also said other famous things like, let food be your medicine. So we'll talk about that connection a little bit. So when we're talking about the gut microbiota, just by definition, I think we have to talk a little bit about what they are. So in and on your body, there are approximately 100 trillion microbial cells. Now, when I say microbial cells, I don't mean just bacteria, even though bacteria are a major component. There are other types of microbes. There are eukaryotic microbes, there are fungi, there are viruses, there are worms, helminths. There are a lot of different types of microbes. We tend to, in the Northern Hemisphere, not have so many of the worm type here, but certainly we have a lot of different microbes. And this picture was, I would say, a little bit of an overstatement back in the day. The idea is that, you know, there's about 3 times more microbial cells than human cells in your body. It's probably more like 1.3 microbial cells per human cell. So we are still outnumbered, but it probably depends on who you're talking to. So the number of cells in our body that are our own are actually outnumbered by the number that aren't. And so that begs the question, well, what are they doing? How are they affecting us? And we don't look like this person here, right? And why is that? Well, microbial cells, especially the bacteria in particular, are about 50 times smaller than your own body's cell. So that's why you just, you know, you still look like a person and not a big conglomerate of microbes. When we talk about the genetics, now this is where it gets a little bit more interesting. There are a tremendous number of genes that are represented by those microbes. So we are dwarfed by the genetics of the microbes that are in and on us. We only have about 23,000 genes, give or take, and there are about 2 million plus microbial genes. So the genetic potential there is quite massive. And this has caused a lot of hype. As you've heard, the microbiome has been generating a lot of interest in our ecosystem. Microbes make the man, fellow travelers, all this kind of stuff. And it's making some people wonder, am I the victim of my microbiome? And, you know, we'll see if there are ways that you might be able to adjust that. So the question has become, what are these microbes? Who are they? What are they doing? And how do they affect us? And you might be wondering, well, how do we even know that they do affect us? Maybe they're just in our body or on our body, and all they're doing is being there because they have a nice warm place to be, right? Fair question. Well, just to kind of give you an idea of how this hype in research has actually, if you follow the money, right? Not to say that it's always better to follow the money, but if you follow the money over the last few years from 2007 up to 2016, the amount of US dollars invested in microbiome research has just been increasing, not quite exponentially, but quite significantly. So there's definitely a lot of interest. And why is there this kind of interest? Well, the microbiome seems to be quite a powerful thing. For example, if you take an individual who is obese, here you can see an A here, this obese individual, and you take their microbiome and their gut microbiome, and we're going to talk about where most of these bacteria reside. The vast majority of them are in your colon. You take a transplant of those microbes, put them into a lean mouse, that mouse will become obese on the same diet it was eating before. So there's some power there. Those microbes seem to be having an effect on the way the metabolism goes. Now, if you take a lean individual and you transplant the microbes from this lean individual into a mouse, the mouse stays lean. But if you transplant the microbes from this obese mouse into that lean mouse, it also becomes obese. So there's even you can transmit this from one organism to another, and even from one generation to another, which is another story. But the real thing that's caused a little bit of a hype in, I would say, somewhat of a cottage industry of fecal microbial transplantation, unfortunately, is this idea that you can take microbes from someone who's lean, transplant them into somebody who's obese, or maybe has a certain type of issue with their metabolic syndrome or something, and that will actually lead to improved insulin sensitivity. And so these are the kinds of studies, even though this person doesn't miraculously become lean, right? That doesn't happen. It's not quite that miraculous, but certainly the effect on metabolism is very real. So how is it that these microbes are having this effect, and what are they really doing? Well, one major challenge in studying the microbiota, as I brought up earlier, is that there are just so many of them, and they are so different, and we are very different in our microbiomes. So how do we actually study this? How do we even make conclusions about it? Well, one thing that we've noted over time, or researchers have noted as they've been studying the microbiota, is that there's a tendency to have more diverse microbes in healthier people. So if you eat a diverse diet, you have greater microbial diversity, and as a result of that greater microbial diversity, you have less inflammation, less frailty. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean it's a result, right? These could be just correlations. So, some people say, well, is it causative? Who knows? But it does turn out that less diverse microbes also correlate with higher inflammation, more frailty as you get older, these kinds of issues. So it's definitely clear that there are, if you have, and when I say diversity, I mean how many different types of microbes and how evenly spread they are. So there's two different sort of measures of that. And when you look at the number of types and you look at the evenness of the spread, if you get richness would be the number of types, diversity would be how evenly they're spread, you get a better idea of, well, wait a minute, that having a rich variety of microbes there seems to be really important, and having diversity that's more even is also good. So when we look at the microbiome as it develops, so when you're a baby, you start out with a seeding of your microbiome by your mother, and through your mother. In fact, there are studies showing now that there are specific microbes that can even be found in utero. It was thought that was a borderline sterile environment, but that doesn't seem to be the case. Not very many though. So the major seeding event that takes place is actually once the baby is born and it passes through the vaginal canal, or in this case, we're not showing it, but if they were born by cesarean section, there's a significant impact on the type of microbes. So for example, they would be populated with microbes more present on just the skin. If they come out through C-section, if they come out through the vaginal canal, they're going to be coated with microbes that you find there, and then those microbes will populate them. And how you feed them, whether they're breastfed or formula fed, affects the type of microbes. When we're looking at the phylum level, you can see there are the pink ones and the green ones, and you don't have to memorize all this, right? But it's interesting to note that there are big differences between whether a baby is born or a baby is fed formula or a baby is breastfed. And that's something that's, I think, very important. We're going to talk a little bit about shortly as well. The two major phyla are Firmicutes and Bacteroidetes. These are the ones that really are the main ones that you find in your gut, and there are a lot of species within them. So the human microbiota, just to kind of tell you a little bit more, reiterate sort of where they are and how they develop. So the vast majority of them are found in our gastrointestinal tract. And the reason I'm talking primarily about bacteria in this talk is because they're the ones that have been really most studied. The others we're still working on, particularly the viruses. That's an area, I would say it's quite a black area right now. So 95% of the bacteria are in our gut. Over 1,000 different species have been identified in people. And that doesn't mean that you personally have 1,000 different species on you. You probably have what they found is on average about between 100 and 200-ish species of bacteria per person, depending on how diverse your microbiota is. And it interacts with you. So your microbiota is interacting with you across this very large surface area, about 900 square feet. So it is not a small section that it interacts with you. And we're going to take a little look at that shortly here. So one thing, as I was mentioning the difference between formula and breastfeeding, one key interesting thing that is found in breast milk is, did you know that you have fiber in your breast milk? Did you know that humans have fiber in breast milk? That sounds like the most foreign thing that there would be in breast milk, but it turns out there is. So there's soluble fiber there. It's called, we call them human milk oligosaccharides, or sugars found in the breast milk that are not digestible by you, but are specifically digestible quite readily by bacteria in your gut. And these bacteria, particularly the bifidobacteria, will process those human milk oligosaccharides, or those human milk sugars, those fibers, into short chain fatty acids, or SCFAs. And we're going to talk more about the benefits of short chain fatty acids. So you get this nice milk as you're drinking the breast milk as a child, and eventually by the time you're about 3, your microbiota stabilizes. It's quite unstable before that time. One of the major issues is actually that a lot of people take a lot of antibiotics very early in life, and that can cause quite the dramatic shift in the microbiota, and that's something we could talk about a bit more, and if we have some questions on that. But the idea is it stabilizes by about 3, and having these beneficial bacteria actually helps prevent autoimmune type diseases, is really good to prevent things like asthma and allergies and so forth. And how is it now, once you are weaned, that you replace those fibers? Well, you start to eat foods that contain fibers, right? So you have good foods, like here we have a picture of some Saskatoon berries. We find lots of them out here where I am in Alberta, but you can find in blueberries, in onions, and leeks, in vegetables, fruits, nuts, particularly certain onions and leeks. You find soluble fibers in high quantities, and those will really support the good bacteria. So we call them prebiotic. On the other hand, if you eat something more like a meat, there's good evidence, and we'll look a little bit at that, that this promotes the more putrefactive types of microbes. They have some toxic byproducts. So how does this all work? Let's look at a picture here of first the place where it's happening, right? So, you know, I'm not gonna start going through the anatomy of everything here, but basically you can see that there is, in this photo, I don't really have a pointer here. I guess my, doesn't let me point. But if you look, you can, most of you know what the colon is that, large part that where the vast majority of the bacteria are located. It's labeled there, and you have, the different parts of the colon. But notice that the small intestine, which is much longer, attaches to the colon down at a place at the ileum where there's this ileocecal junction. So there's the cecum, and then that sort of upper ascending colon continues from there. And that ileocecal junction is quite important because some of you may have heard of things like SIBO, or small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. That could be because of backup and ileocecal valve issues. And we won't talk too in depth about that, but if you have questions about that, we'll talk about it at the end a little bit more. So I want to review now, because now we know where the small intestine is. So the small intestine doesn't have the majority of bacteria, but for the purposes of this illustration, I want to just take a look, because there's a really nice video that shows sort of why that surface area is so huge. So there's an interesting thing that happens. This is a short video. Hopefully you guys can see this. So I was just coming in, looking at the intestine and the crypts, and how this bowel actually looks from Hans Cleaver's lab out in Utrecht. So you can see the villi, these little nodules sticking up. Now, what's important about them? They provide a huge surface area for absorption of your food, right? Of the nutrients from your food, because the vast majority of absorption is happening in your small bowel, right? And notice there are these crypts, and at the base of the crypt you have stem cells, and those stem cells are providing new cells continuously up towards the villus. So you'll see that start happening shortly here. So say they label a stem cell there, and you can watch that come, and they've been using some fancy genetic means to label this. This is just kind of a reenactment of it. But and then those cells differentiate, some of them becoming goblet cells that produce mucus. So lining your gut. The two key points I want to bring out here is you only have a single layer of cells lining that gut that's preventing connection or interaction with the the underlying tissue. And above that layer of cells is a layer of mucus, and that layer of mucus is really key. So we're going to talk more about that. And notice how when the two opposing sides meet, the top, these cells die. They die by anoikis. It's a death by detachment, and this is continuously happening. A very protective mechanism in your gut. Why? Because then those cells can't linger, and all those terrible foods that you ate and all the carcinogens you've ingested don't have the time to cause mutations in them that would lead to cancer. Or if they do have a mutation, well, they're going to die really soon anyway, so it's not too big of a deal. And this does happen where, for example, and you'll see this briefly here now, if you do have a mutation that leads to an adenoma there, or you have a mutation that leads to more cells not continuing on to differentiate, but forming more of a polyp in that region, what ends up happening is those cells can linger there for a longer time, be exposed to the carcinogens for a longer time, and then it's more likely for you to have cancer. So that's why, the doctor will tell you, oh, you've got a polyp, we need to remove it. We really don't want you to have, greater likelihoods of cancer. So here you see these cells forming and more and more of them. And now you get this region of extra cells that now need to be, unfortunately removed. Otherwise, they're just going to keep on multiplying, and there are stem cells supplying that. So it grows into this growth that's continuously exposed, or at least in that region can be affected by carcinogens. So that's just kind of more of where the microbiome is interacting with you. So important to know kind of the placement of things and what's going on. So continuing on, remember that single layer of cells. So you have this epithelial layer, and above that layer, you have mucus. And notice how in the picture I'm showing you there are bacteria, these happy green bacteria that are sitting in this mucus layer. And they're going to stay happy as long as you keep feeding them, okay? And what do they like to eat? They like to eat the fibers, particularly the soluble fibers that you get in foods. When these soluble fibers come here, the bacteria will process them and make them by their own metabolism. One type of bacteria, Faecalibacterium prausnitzii, is going to be able to metabolize the butyrate or the fibers into butyrates, and that butyrate gets absorbed by your intestinal epithelial cells. And not only is it a source of energy for those cells, which is an important part of its benefit, it also dampens inflammation. So it inhibits the inflammatory response there. So it's actually kind of a signal that, you know what, these bacteria that are there are good, they're healthy, they're not going to affect me, they're actually helping me. I shouldn't react, I shouldn't freak out. And they're all happily staying in that mucus layer, right? On the other hand, if you start to starve those microbes, so if you're not providing the fibers that you should be eating in order to maintain that population, what ends up happening is they start eating your mucus. Some of them do. Certain ones, we call them mucolytic bacteria, they have the capacity to chew up the mucus, because mucus turns out to also be carbohydrate that has very similar structure and well, not exactly the same structure, but it has structures that are usable by these bacteria for their energy source. So if you don't feed them, they eat you, basically. And once they've eaten you, your layer becomes thin, and now certain bacteria that may be more pathogenic, they have a greater likelihood of getting in. And unfortunately, these opportunistic microbes, even the toxins from them, can come in, increase inflammation. So you get sort of a leaky gut syndrome happening here. And there's been a lot of research into just how this works. And there's some pretty high power papers like one in Cell that showed this specifically through a high fiber versus low fiber diet. Continuing on, let me see. So just to kind of give you an idea, and this is there's a lot of different fibers in mother's milk. So these are the milk fibers. Just there's a whole gamut of them here that we were involved in identifying at one point during some studies I did at Sick Kids with Richard Wu, who's was fantastic. He's now in medical school there, and interesting study he did, which was quite fascinating to me, was we did an in vitro study where we looked at the intestinal epithelial cells. And you notice if you're looking at those cells, you can see in the control on the top left, you can see that there's this green layer that kind of goes around each cell. And that you could see as kind of the patio cement, if you will, that's holding those patio blocks together. Those are the junctions that hold those epithelial cells together and prevent stuff from leaking through. So that's a good thing that's there. If you treat these bacteria, these epithelial cells in a tissue culture dish with an infective bacterium like enterohemorrhagic E. coli or EHEC, what'll happen is it busts those junctions apart, opens them up, and allows the bacteria to get through. And what he found, which was quite amazing, was that if he pre-treated these cells with human milk sugars, so purified from mother's milk, from a bunch of mother's milk, they were protected from this effect. The enterohemorrhagic E. coli was unable to get through there and bust them apart, even without any other bacteria there. So there are benefits of these fibers, even without other bacteria. This is just a measure of just how much. This was actually to see how much is leaking through these layers, and we could see very clearly that in the presence of the sugar, it was protected. So you weren't getting the HMO plus EHEC. This large molecular weight sugar wasn't able to pass through those channels. And this is interesting, but for the interest of time, I won't talk too much about it. It's more what we found. Just to quickly, briefly, you don't have to look at the slides too much. We found that actually the sugars, the human milk sugars, they actually upregulate chaperones that help make the mucus. So more mucus gets made, and that could be one of the reasons why this is protective. All right. So what about diet and the microbiome? You're probably wondering, of course, diet has an impact, but how much of an impact, how rapid of an impact? If you eat, if you've been eating bad things for a long time or good things for a long time, or however, how quickly can things change? Well, it turns out in about 3 or 4 days, things can change quite rapidly in the microbiota. So in this study, what they did was they compared an animal-based diet, meat, eggs, cheeses, and a plant-based diet with grains, legumes, fruits, vegetables, and looked at the types of changes that could occur when you switched people back and forth between these diets. So some of you may not be willing to do that kind of a study if you have a particular dietary preference, but they did find some volunteers who were vegetarian who were willing, okay, for the sake of the study, I'll eat the meat, right? And they watched the shifts. And without going into too much detail, basically what they found, not surprisingly, is on a plant-based diet, you have a high fiber intake. Animal-based diet, not so much. The fat intake, of course, is higher on an animal-based diet. Protein intake is higher on an animal-based diet as well. So you can see this difference. Higher fiber, animal protein, and meat has one thing in common with itself, obviously, is that it has zero fiber in it, no fiber at all. So this clearly was happening. They noticed actually that there was a change in the time it took for you to get rid of your waste. So transit time was slowed down significantly, but not massively, but significantly. And I'm sure if you did it over a longer period of time, it would have had even a more dramatic effect. And the key thing that I want to get across is not only is having the fiber helpful, right, from the plant-based diet, the meat and animal products and the fats, the animal fats, they tend to feed bacteria that produce toxic metabolites. So this was from the same study. They found that deoxycholic acid levels increased on the animal-based diet quite rapidly in response to change to that animal-based diet. So this and DCA, deoxycholic acid, is not an unstudied molecule. People have looked at this, and it's been clearly shown to damage DNA and promote liver cancer. So it's a known carcinogen. So it's really quite clear that these diets are at high levels, at least, and these were pretty high levels, are promoting the production of these kinds of metabolites. On the flip side, the products or byproducts, we talked about butyrate before, of fiber metabolism by the microbes are actually very protective against cancers. So without reading into the slides all that much, one key thing to say is butyrate seems to be key. They did a very carefully controlled study. I remember going to the talk by the guy who did this study, and it was fascinating because essentially he showed that the butyrate itself was really important because they were able to colonize mice with bacteria that had no ability. They were the same bacteria that were beneficial normally, but they could not metabolize fiber into butyrate, and they lost the beneficial effect when they did that. So if you take this no butyrate producer and you give it the high fiber diet, you still get lots of tumors. But if you allow this wild type butyrate producer there, it has just much less cancer in these mice. And then you could actually feed butyrate directly, and that worked. But one thing that's important is they were gavaging that butyrate right to the place where it would be active. If you ate butyrate straight, the vast majority of it would be absorbed in your small bowel, and you would not get it in your colon where it's beneficial. So it's not recommended for you to just go and eat a bunch of butyrate. It's not going to help you. However, they are coming up with some, how do we say, drugs which essentially will carry butyrate in a form that won't get absorbed down to your colon, where then it can be used. So, artificial fiber effect, if you will. Here's that study that really clearly showed this dietary fiber and fiber loss effect. So if you deprive the gut microbes of fiber, they will chew up that mucus layer, and you get more problems. Eroded mucus layer, higher levels of inflammation in these mice. Okay, so the key point here is don't starve your microbial self. This was Erica and Justin Sonnenberg made this point. It pays to feed your fellow travelers. They'll thank you for it, and they won't eat you, right? It's the main point. Now I want to touch on something, speaking of like feeding, right? So this is quite an incredible, I don't know if any of you are aware of Prader-Willi syndrome. So in this syndrome, in children, the children have low muscle tone, so they typically don't engage in as much physical activity, and they're basically genetically obese. So in this syndrome, they have an issue with the paternal gene that's causing, we don't even know all the molecular details of how it works, but it's causing these several of things. One is this low muscle tone. Another is this chronic uncontrollable feeling of hunger. So your child, you guys, if you have children, you realize that they're already hungry as it is, right? For them to be even more hungry would, could be over the top. And then they don't have the ability to really feel that they're fed. So they continue to eat even though they're full. And so this food craving behavior ends up happening. Interestingly, so there's Liping Zhao from Shanghai. He has done studies to show that even in children like this, if you feed them a high fiber diet, okay, essentially it can, even in these, of course, now that's pretty controlled, right? Because these children are no longer allowed to eat, right, whatever they want. They're eating this high fiber diet. It will actually help reverse that that obesity. So both genetic obesity and simple obesity can be reversed through a high fiber diet in his studies. So quite amazing work, and I think shows the power of getting the right bacteria in your gut fed by those those fibers that can be beneficial. Another study that he also did, which is much more recent, is, well, I guess in 2018, this was in Science. So type 2 diabetes, interestingly, the data is becoming more and more clear that type 2 diabetes, I think we've known this for a long time, but I don't think the mainstream literature has accepted it, that type 2 diabetes is a reversible disease. Here he's shown that you can actually selectively promote good gut bacteria through dietary fiber and alleviate type 2 diabetes. So that was a Science paper, which, I mean, I guess we've shown this kind of stuff has been shown in other studies. Other point, just to kind of nail the point home, that the fiber is not just working through the bacteria. It appears to work also independently. So just like the human milk sugars, as we showed, it wasn't something very specific to human milk sugars. It seems that other fibers, soluble fibers, one being inulin and another short chain fructooligosaccharides, or SC-FOS, they have the similar beneficial effects to human milk sugars. And so that really, you can benefit from fiber in this way, even if you're not drinking mother's milk, right? Finally, I want to, because I know I don't want to go too much longer than to allow some time for questions. I want to talk a little bit about flaxseed. Some of you have you guys heard of flaxseed before? Yes, maybe. You're not allowed to talk to me anyway, so we'll talk more later. But I'm sure many of you have eaten flax or used flax in a variety of things. Now, flaxseed contains a lot of omega-3. We know it for that. But one thing that flaxseed is really actually high in, it's the highest dietary source known, it's something called the pre-lignans or the lignans. Now, they're not lignans at this point, but they're molecules that can be processed to lignans. And interestingly, some recent work from Peter Turnbow's lab out in, I think he's at UCSF now. I can't remember where he's at. Anyway, Peter Turnbow, very kind of top-notch microbiome researcher. He's been showing that it's actually a series of microbes that process the molecules from, in particular, this Agarthala lenta processes the lignans to form their bioactive components. And these are these how do we call them, polyphenols, these really potently active biological molecules, which are very health promoting, are actually in a large part made by bacteria, well, not made by them, but processed to the active form by microbes in your gut. And that's actually the only way that they really get activated. So, some of the health benefits that you get from flax, it's not just the omega-3. You're feeding certain bacteria which are able to provide other side benefits. So it's worth looking at these bacteria. And he was trying to, in fact, he did a lot of challenging studies to try and reiterate this pathway in vitro so that it could be proven that this is actually what's happening, because it's a pretty complex place that this is all happening in your gut, and many of those bacteria are anaerobic. So one final point I want to bring up, I didn't include slides here, but there's been some interesting studies out of Cornell showing that diet is very important for the microbiome, but it doesn't seem to be the only key determinant. There are other important things that are affecting the microbiome. And so we don't really know for sure which ones affect the microbiota the most. Could have to do with circadian rhythms, could have to do with a variety of different things. But one key point is exercise. Exercise seems to modify the gut microbiota in a significant way. And so that's something that is worth further study, is what are the other lifestyle effects outside of diet that are impacting the microbiota, and how are ways that we can improve the microbes in us by affecting those lifestyle habits. So with that, I just want to summarize here quickly. So if all of that other stuff was kind of like Chinese, then pay attention to these main points. Fiber, 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 right? So fiber is feeding the good bacteria. It keeps them happy and not eating your mucus layers. That's number one point. Fiber will feed the good guys, and they will actually feed your colon. And the type of metabolism that they promote is actually a type that prevents cancer. Now, how in the world does that work? Well, cancer is, some of you might be aware of the Warburg effect, but cancer likes to take and process sugar and produce oxygen sometimes, actually, but not use oxygen. So glycolytic metabolism doesn't require oxygen. And that's actually a problem, because in your gut, you want there to not be oxygen. I know this sounds maybe counterintuitive, but that's a place where oxygen shouldn't be found. And what some very amazing research out of California, Andreas Baumler's lab, he has shown that when you effectively change the type of metabolism happening in the gut, that is the tipping point. Because what it does is it leads to more oxygen in that environment, and then the bacteria that can use oxygen start to take over. And so that's really the big shift that takes place. Fiber also directly signals your intestinal epithelium to protect itself. So we talked about it doesn't have to go through the microbiota. The fiber can help in other ways. And then animal proteins, high in fat and sugars, they could feed the bad guys, producing putrefactive byproducts. And so you want to try and avoid them. Polyphenols that are found in fruits, veggies, nuts, those kinds of places. And some of the they could also be prebiotic. They don't have to be, it doesn't have to just be fiber. They can have benefits, like, for example, the lignans we talked about. So with that, can I take some questions here? I can stop the share for now.
Yes, thanks Pekka, thanks Dr. Maattanen for the amazing talk. I'm really fascinated by some of the things you shared about how breast milk has fiber. I didn't really realize that. So that was really fascinating, and even the information about the Prader-Willi syndrome, that was really, really interesting. It shows how powerful the gut microbiome really is.
Right.
We do have questions, Dr. Maattanen, so we'll get right into them. All right, we have about 15 or so minutes, so that's really good timing on your end. All right, so I'm gonna say your name and then I'll say the question. All right, and as we're doing, please feel free to keep on asking questions. We will try to get to as many as we can. So Roy Kim is asking the question: Hi Pekka, what is your take on dietary supplements that claim to promote healthy gut lining?
Well, it depends on the supplement, I guess, right? But I would say, in it clearly in its natural form, generally speaking, why pay for a supplement that you can get in the food that you can eat? So I would say, if you're talking about things like inulin or soluble fiber supplements, these are often, you could get them in the pharmacy. You can get fiber supplements. Um, they don't taste so good. They're just, yeah, they're added items, and they may have benefits. Not to say that it won't have a benefit, but if you can get it from a food item, I would say that would be your best bet.
Great. And just for some who join a little bit later, we do have a disclaimer that Dr. Maatanen's information is for educational purposes only. So before applying anything, please speak with the healthcare provider. All right. Miriam Berlin asked the question, can you elaborate on the relationship of microbiota and IBS, irritable bowel syndrome?
Irritable bowel syndrome. So that's different from IBD, right? Because IBS is a syndrome, and I'm by no means a specialist in IBS, but it's more of a psychosomatic type of disease. George might be able to speak more about it, but it really, the gut-brain axis, I didn't even really touch on that much here. There's most certainly, so if you're asking me how to deal with this specifically, I would say one key thing to note for every one of you is everybody's an individual. And when it comes to the microbiota, there are a lot of healthy people that have different microbiotas, right? And there are a lot of sick people that also have very different microbiotas. How do you know which is good and which is bad? That's the hard part. So I would say on a case-to-case basis, this is where we have to assess. And so it would be important for an individual like this with IBS to go through a careful assessment on their specific situation, and then somebody could make a call there. Yeah, that's what I would say.
Thanks, Dr. Martin, and thanks, Miriam, for the question. Donisha is asking the question, if you're eating enough fiber, do you still need a probiotic?
So interestingly, there have been some, so there was a recent study that was quite extensive, and I didn't get to touch on it here because I'm not certain if it's published yet, but they showed that the fiber has a significant effect on the microbiome as we talk. But it turns out that fermented foods actually have a more dramatic, or at least similarly and even more so dramatic, impact on the microbiota. Now, I was a little surprised by this result because it was quite a cataloging study that they did this in. So I would say that fermented foods, which are probiotic, right, by kimchi and sauerkraut and those kind of things, very beneficial. Probiotics in and of themselves, the pills, they tend to be quite transient. They don't stay in you for very long. So it's better to support the correct bacteria by what you eat has been my estimation there. And that's been studied quite extensively. So yeah, probiotics are not necessarily necessary if you're getting enough fiber and you don't have any other symptoms.
Great. This is a very interesting question from Charles Nazaire. And sorry if I didn't say your name properly. Which onions are the best? This is very interesting.
Which onions are the best? Well, that's a good question. Leeks are actually particularly good, but garlic, leeks, onions. The one that's really the superpower, it's not actually an onion. It's the Jerusalem artichoke, which I don't know if any of you have eaten. But notice one thing that I would caution you on: some of these very high fiber foods, if you ingest a lot of them very quickly, you'll have some gas issues. So you want to, just like a person starting to eat beans, you want to be kind of gradual. But yeah, that's a really good question. I don't know which of the onions is the is the best. I wish I did. I'll have to look that up. But yeah, eat
He,
onions, they're good.
he follows up here with I think for fiber content and polyphenols.
For fiber content and polyphenols,
Yeah.
well, for yeah. So it depends on which fiber. So I think the inulins and the short chain fructooligosaccharides are the two that would be the main soluble fibers. And which particular onion is the top? Man, I don't know, actually. We'll have to do the Google search and check it out. I bet you the information is available, though. So
Okay, great. Thanks, Charles, for that very, very interesting question. Arlette Susanna is asking a question. I think you touched a little bit on it, but she asking for a little bit, she adds a little bit more foods here. So what's your opinion on kombucha, sauerkraut, yogurt, kefir, and other fermented foods that are said to improve the gut flora? So you're talking about kimchi and fermented foods, but how about like sauerkraut,
yeah,
yogurt, kefir?
yeah. So okay, so when it comes to the plant-based probiotic foods like kimchi, sauerkraut, and so forth, they definitely and other probiotic containing foods. That study that I was talking about, they allowed people to use any probiotic they wanted. So I think this was actually from Justina Sonnenberg's lab. Now that I remember it, no, Erica Sonnenberg, yeah, out at Stanford. So look that up, Erica Sonnenberg Stanford study, because that study has shown that fermented foods of any sort have significant effects on the microbiota. Are they health beneficial or not? They seem to indicate that they would likely be. My only concern, this is from other studies I've done for some of the dairy products, is that they contain or they may contain other bacteria which have been linked to not so good things. So, for example, if you want to get yourself on a rabbit trail, look up Mycobacterium avium paratuberculosis. This particular bacterium has been linked by some to IBD. I'm not saying it is causative, but there are lots of studies showing, and about 30 to 40% of dairy herds in Canada are actually infected with this bacterium. So it's a slow grower. I would be cautious about that because of the bulk tanking that's done with milk. So
Great. Thank you for the question, Arlette. Moving on here. And sorry if I don't see any Amuet. What are your recommendations regarding fiber in the presence of SIBO? That's a very interesting question.
SIBO?
So
yeah.
I have SIBO and fiber.
Yeah. So here's my take on this, and it might seem oversimplistic, but if you want to read a great book that I would highly recommend, written by actually John Harvey Kellogg, it's called The Itinerary of a Breakfast, and what it does is it follows a breakfast through the food tube, and look it up. It's hard to find. It's kind of a rare book, but it's hilarious to read and it's quite wonderful. One thing about fiber is it makes you regular. We all know that. We knew that before all these benefits we're talking about. So fiber has this idea that it clears you out quite regularly. Now, if you have issues with constipation, what can happen is, and this is what he gets at in this book, is that I very briefly mentioned when we looked at the anatomy slide there, that there is an ileocecal valve between your ileum and your colon, your cecum, really the first part of your colon initially there. That valve can start to get a pressure buildup there such that you have leakage, because think about it, the vast majority, I should almost pull up the I don't know if I can screen share that briefly here.
Yeah.
I'll do it really quickly. Let me just pull up the anatomy slide here. Where was it here? So remember that there's the ileum is the lower part of the small bowel, and then it connects to the cecum. At that part where the connection, that junction, remember the vast majority of bacteria are in your colon. So when you have small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, where do you think they're coming from? They're coming from your colon. How are they getting there? You have an incompetent ileocecal valve. that would be I'm not a physician, but if you've had issues with constipation any time in your life and there has been some leakage up there, it could be an issue. Now, I'm not saying that's going to be the issue in every case, but this could be one. So fiber, if you already have SIBO, is fiber going to help? Again, an individual person, individual treatment plans. I'm not here to give a blanket thing, but I would say if you can gradually get more and more fiber in your diet without having massive inflammation and issues, yeah, there's a lot of work coming out of the Mayo Clinic on SIBO, and I can't really speak to all of that. I'm not a clinician on it, but that's kind of my take on it. So I'll stop my share.
Great, and thank you so much for the question. Denisha again is asking a question: what do you suggest for leaky gut?
For leaky gut, well, fiber. Surprise. But really, if you've already got issues with inflammation, unfortunately, you may need to, and this is where you have to be careful, because some of the foods, so it's not a one size fits all strategy. So some foods will actually perturb things worse if you add like really foods that are readily fermented very quickly into your diet. You could get some issues with gas, and that can be problematic. So adding gradually and slowly more fiber to your diet would be a good idea, and soluble fiber in particular, so that those bacteria get fed. Because you want to restore the mucus layer. Once that mucus layer is back in shape, then you're golden. But until that point, you really, you're struggling, right?
Right. Okay, great. Thank you so much for the question. Again, Amuet, can you talk more about short chain fatty acids? So that's a big question, but maybe is there stuff about short chain fatty acids that you haven't talked about that you'd like to just kind of briefly point out? We have like about 2 or 3 minutes. So
yeah, there's several different types of short chain fatty acids. Butyrate and acetate seem to be the main ones. They're just, well, two key things that I'll highlight again. Basically, they dampen inflammation, and they enhance, and they feed your colonocytes in the gut. There's only one cell in your body that uses those short chain fatty acids as energy. There's only one cell in your body that actually, or not one cell, but one type of cell in the body that actually relies on an outside energy source like that. That was pre-metabolized by someone else, and those are those colonocytes. Other ones rely on glucose and that kind of thing. So yeah, they're very, very useful and important for your gut.
Great.
Lots of evidence.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for the question. Last few questions here. Riza is asking, what are your thoughts about the effects of vinegar on the gut? That's a very interesting question.
Vinegar. Yeah, it is a good question. I mean, one thing you have to ask yourself is, how far does that get, right? I mean, the dosage of vinegar, the amount you take in. One thing that highly acidic foods coming in, are they going to affect, lower down, or are you going to get more acidification lower down? You actually want to have a fairly acidic colon, but your stomach, right, you don't want it too much. So I would say those kinds of acids probably going to have more effects on your upper gastrointestinal tract, and lower down, the effects might not be as big later. So yeah, I think the irritation effects would be higher up. That would be my take on it.
Mm-hmm.
I'd be curious to do a study.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Riza, for the question. And the next question is a very interesting one by Robert. I have trouble with beans. I love them, but they give me the runs. What can I do if I want to be a vegan?
I want to be a vegan. Wow. Well, beans aren't the only vegan food, but one thing that's important about beans. So I've become a little bit of a bean snob personally. One key, depending on who you are, you may get beans in a can. You may get beans. I can no longer. It's not that I can't tolerate them. I just can't stand the taste of beans that I get in a can from the grocery store. Soak them overnight. Cook them in a pressure cooker. Rinse them really, really well before you do that. After the overnight soaking, that can help get rid of some of that. How do we say? Material that leads to more flatulence and more irritation. Any
Great.
other questions?
One last question here. What is the name of that bacteria in milk linked to IBD?
I can write it in the chat here if that's better.
Okay.
Let me just put it in the chat myself. It's Mycobacterium avium. Oh, it doesn't like.
All right. Well,
Mycobacterium avium. Yes.
great. Well, it is 8 o'clock, and we want to respect your time. We just want to thank everyone for joining in today, and thank you so much, Dr. Maattanen, for the information that you shared. We just want to let everyone know about our next webinar that's coming up next Thursday. We're answering common objections to plant-based eating. So today we learned about the importance of plant-based nutrition, but of course, in our conversations with people, sometimes they bring objections and questions. So we're going to bring a doctor and also a registered dietitian to answer some of the common objections that people have. So we want to encourage you to go to our website and to register for that, and also to share with others. So again, thank you, Dr. Martin, for donating your time. It was really fascinating. And thank you so much for everyone for coming. This would not be half as interesting if you weren't here. So thank you so much for coming, and have a blessed week. Thank you.
Yeah, take care. Thank you.